Welcome everybody to this afternoon's webinar of the Irish Studies program. Delighted to be welcoming our speaker from New Mexico today and to learning about questions of diversity, which are of such cultural importance and dominate our thoughts as a society. My name is Daniel Carey. I'm director of the Moore Institute. We're very happy to be hosting today. Matthew Garrity, whose name you see there, is doing the work behind the scenes, and we're happy as ever to help out with this and to welcome you to 2022 on behalf of the seminar, which has been a recurrent feature of activities, our intellectual life here in not just in the Moore Institute, but in the College of Arts and NUI Galway generally. So just remains for me to hand over to Verena Commons. So Verena, over to you as our chair and host today.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the first Irish Studies Seminar of 2022. And my pleasure indeed to welcome Dr. Sarah Townsend, then today's guest speaker from the University of New Mexico. And Sarah is Assistant Professor of English and co-founder of the Irish Studies Programme at the University of New Mexico. And her research and teaching centres on race and the transnational formation of Irish identity. She's the author of a number of published and forthcoming articles on Irish literature and culture, and is co-editor of a forthcoming volume on the Irish Bildungsroman. She's held residential fellowships at Notre Dame and Wellesley College, and her current research examines the transatlantic racial history of the term New Irish. She is also the adopted Korean granddaughter of Irish American immigrants and has recently is a recently naturalised Irish citizen. So congratulations on that, Sarah. And just before I do hand you over, I'm delighted also to welcome Dr. Cian McMahon, historian from the University of Nevada, as our guest respondent today. So Cian is certainly no stranger to the Centre for Irish Studies. We were just discussing, he was here back in 2013 on the IACI NUI Galway Fellowship. Can't quite believe it's that long ago. And he'll be responding then to some of the themes and issues that addressed by Sarah. And of course, we'll open it up to everybody for any questions or comments that you may have, and you can use the Q&A function to do that. So the title of today's seminar is A Whiter Shade of Diversity, Citizenship and the New Irish Americans. And I will hand it over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Verena. Thanks to Dan and Matthew for making this all happen. And I want to thank Nessa Cronin, who couldn't be here today, but who invited me to present my work in progress, and to Cian for agreeing to respond. Let me share my screen and we'll get started here. So 2 weeks after the 2016 United States presidential election, the Washington Post published an article titled "Trump Victory Has Ireland Worried About Its Undocumented Immigrants in the US." Prompted by the president-elect's promises to detain and deport thousands of migrants within 100 days of entering office, the article was the first in what would become a series of mainstream media pieces covering the plight of the undocumented Irish. For instance, the Irish Times, "Undocumented Irish in America, come in legit or stay at home." NPR, "Undocumented Irish caught in Trump's immigration dragnet." The Guardian, "Enda Kenny urges Trump to help undocumented Irish living in US." And CNN, "White, Irish, and Undocumented in America." And this is just a small sampling. The latter piece illustrates really vividly the sensationalist tone that the less subtle of these articles would typically employ. It opens, "They're spared the glances, the 'go back to your country' slurs facing so many undocumented migrants in the US, but they live in fear. They don't call the police when there's a break-in. They think twice before they bring a sick child to the emergency room. Only they're white and they're Irish." The seeming incongruity of the white undocumented Irish made for a compelling story. Articles, radio stories, and television documentaries profiled upstanding Irish Americans who had been living in the shadows for years, even decades, unbeknownst to those around them. In the words of John Cunningham, an undocumented individual interviewed by several media outlets and then subsequently deported in 2017, Most people think undocumented, and they think people who come across the southern border. They're not thinking about the Irish guy who lives right next to them. The surprising fact for many Americans of undocumented Irish people's very existence was amplified by the shock they felt when they were apprehended, detained, and deported. High-profile cases like Cunningham's appeared to reveal a chink in the presumed armor afforded by white skin. At the same time, media stories about the undocumented Irish in the US often reinforced a narrative of white exceptionalism, for which they were rightly criticized. Those advocating on behalf of the undocumented Irish found themselves in an awkward territory. On the one hand, defending people whose racial privileges nevertheless lent insufficient protection from the accelerated immigration crackdowns of the Trump administration. But on the other hand, directing attention and resources toward a small group for whom the consequences of potential deportation were, on average, less severe than they would be for other, mostly non-white, undocumented immigrants. 2016 precipitated a crisis in Irish American racial identity, many aspects of which lie beyond the scope of this presentation. Today, I'm going to focus on a legal facet of this recent crisis, namely the effort to secure residency or citizenship for the undocumented Irish, or at least to forestall deportation, by directing our attention to a prior moment in the 1980s, when immigration advocates banded together in an effort to legalize the Irish migrants of their generation. This earlier case study anticipates the racial catch-22 faced by the undocumented Irish and their supporters in the wake of the 2016 election. And it offers us a framework for recognizing the strategic ways in which Irish whiteness has been renegotiated and redeployed periodically throughout the 20th and 21st centuries and on both sides of the Atlantic. Before proceeding, I think it's important to briefly mention my personal investment in this history and in the larger book project to which it contributes. So in 2017, as Verena mentioned, I became a naturalized Irish citizen by descent. I qualified on the controversial basis of having Irish grandparents adopted, in my case, and the process was disconcertingly easy and quick and inexpensive, in large part because it is implicitly designed for white people of Irish descent and not for people who look like me. My application to be added to the Foreign Births Register transpired at a time when demand for Irish visas was on the rise, in part because of Brexit. And I was also at the time becoming involved in the sanctuary movement in New Mexico. And so was witnessing really close up the devastating effects that US immigration policy has on migrant families. The immense privilege of my dual US-Irish citizenship, the latter afforded by my erroneously presumed whiteness, was and still is difficult to reconcile with the concurrent detention and deportation of so many others at the time, including the undocumented Irish. So what I've come to see is that the history of Irish American immigration and citizenship is rife with white exceptionalism, but it's not reducible to it. And in what follows, I hope to capture some of the nuances of this particular episode in that history. So let's start with the legal situation. Our story begins with the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, which transformed the complexion of US immigration. The act superseded the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, which had governed the immigration system for over 40 years via the national origins quota system that prioritized family unification, that overtly favored white migrants. In its place, Hart-Celler introduced a new preference system that prioritized family unification and employee-sponsored immigration. After the new law went into effect, immigration from Ireland and parts of Europe declined, while immigration from Asia and Latin America climbed. You can see on this chart, the orange and the green go up after Hart-Celler. And these were, trends that were already in the making, but they really take off after 1965. On the other hand, if you follow the yellow line, you can see that immigration from Europe had been declining pretty precipitously since the beginning of the 20th century, undergoes a brief increase during the post-war period, and then after Hart-Celler falls off again. The other thing to note is that this is for Europe as a whole. The numbers for Northern European immigration declines even more steeply in that post-Hart-Celler period. By 1968, the House of Representatives had convened an ad hoc committee to consider potential remedies for the unanticipated decline in Irish and Northern European admissions. Congressional hearings on the issue were held over the course of 1968 and 69, which I'll return to later in this presentation. But legislative attempts to ameliorate the situation stalled out. Fast forward 20 years, and a sizable population of undocumented Irish persons had settled in the US. With little chance of securing permanent legal status, many had entered on student or tourist visas and stayed past their expiration. Estimates vary, from 40,000 to a likely inflated figure of 150,000. However, relief for the Irish appeared to be underway. Two temporary visa programs established in 1986 and 1988 for applicants from countries adversely affected by Hart-Celler, in essence, Europeans, had allowed thousands of Irish to enter the US and become permanent residents. In fact, the first of these programs was designed specifically with the Irish in mind. Furthermore, a piece of legislation called Senate Bill 358 was moving its way through Congress. If enacted, it would create a permanent allotment of visas for non-sponsored or independent immigrants like the Irish. In other words, immigrants who were sponsored neither by their family members nor by potential employers. Enter the immigration lobbyists. In the months leading to the passage of Senate Bill 358, or the Immigration Act of 1990, as it would come to be known, Irish American politicians and lobbyists mobilized in an effort to ensure the legislation's passage. In addition to securing yet another temporary visa program with 40% of the visas reserved just for the Irish, a permanent diversity visa lottery for individuals from low admission countries would begin in 1995, though Irish demand for these visas has consistently underperformed expectations. And I can talk about the difference between adversely affected and low admission in the Q&A. Irish advocates worked in concert with Asian American and Latinx lobbyists who were also working to shape the legislation to benefit their connationals. I'll touch a little bit on this cross-ethnic collaboration and what follows, but if you're interested in this aspect of that history, I delve into it more thoroughly in a forthcoming article in Radical History Review, whose special issue on Irish and World Histories is going to appear this spring, and I'm just really excited for the issue as a whole. Now, I've glossed over this legislative history quickly because today I'm less concerned with the finer details of this episode than I am in what it can teach us about how the Irish have negotiated the terms of their whiteness in the diaspora in the late 20th and 21st centuries. As the United States abandoned nationality and race-based admissions in the post-war period, white individuals found themselves competing for visas within a newly diverse and crowded field. And this was also happening concurrently in other white settler countries like Canada, which abandoned national origins in 1962, and Australia, which abolished the White Australia policy in 1973. The privileged racial status that once allowed their compatriots to migrate with ease now proved incidental to, or even a liability in, Irish migrants' attempts to secure legal residency. In the US, Irish Americans responded by cultivating a strategic variety of whiteness to present before lawmakers and the media, one that performed their solidarity with minority groups, but that also at times invoked really spurious civil rights grievances and peddled coded narratives of white exceptionalism. As we shall see, the Irish American lobby deftly leveraged their ethnic whiteness in order to gain a foothold in the purportedly race-neutral immigration system of the post-Hart-Celler era. So during the early years of this campaign, Irish American supporters leaned heavily on civil rights concepts like inequity and discrimination in order to denounce the obstacles faced by would-be immigrants from Ireland. Perhaps the most blatant instance of this language appears in the comment made by Philip O'Rourke, a representative of the American Irish National Immigration Committee, during one of these congressional hearings held during the late 1960s. He states, "Having corrected such past inequities as the Chinese Exclusion Act, it surely was not the intent of Congress that there be an Irish Exclusion Act contained in the present law." Now, this analogy is undoubtedly egregious. One cannot in good faith compare the post-1965 downturn in Irish and European immigration to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was really a series of laws that barred Chinese immigrants from entering the US for over 60 years, from 1882 to 1943. Chinese exclusion was the product of a concerted racial project meant to suture citizenship to skin color, and in Maid Nye's terms, to construct a white American race. Meanwhile, the downturn in Irish immigration that followed the Immigration Act of 1965 was the unanticipated consequence of reforming a racist system. And in fact, the architects of Hart-Celler were really surprised by the spike in Asian and Latin American immigration. They really believed that the new law would have very little effect on Irish and European admissions. It's also worth noting that not a single participant in these late 60s hearings noted the irony of deploying the rhetoric of civil rights, which was the very movement that precipitated the Hart-Celler Act, that precipitated this reform of a racist system. And they used that rhetoric in order to restore privileges enjoyed by white Europeans under the racist quota system. But O'Rourke's comment also points, I think, to a deeply jarring perceived rupture in the popular narrative of white ethnic assimilation, in which many Irish Americans had come to believe. Today, scholars of Irish America have widely challenged and revised the thesis, popularized by whiteness studies scholars and labor historians of the 1990s, that the Irish were not considered white upon arrival, but became white by the mid or late 19th century. Some of these scholars have challenged that thesis on legal grounds, pointing out that Irish immigrants' whiteness was never in question, insofar as they were eligible for US citizenship, which the Naturalization Act of 1790 reserved for free white persons. Others have done this work by recasting Irish American assimilation as a cultural, gendered, and class-based process rather than merely an explicitly racial one. But at the time of Rourke's congressional testimony in 1969, the myth of Irish American racial advancements from not quite white to indisputably white was alive and well. Over the first half of the 20th century, Irish Americans blended into broader white society in many ways. By moving out of their ethnic urban enclaves, many of which were established in the 19th century, through educational achievement and their advancement into the middle class, and by consolidating their political power, which by 1961 stretched all the way to the White House. By the late 1960s and early 70s, leading Irish American figures like future Senator Daniel P. Moynihan and the sociologist Andrew Greeley were declaring the death of Irish America, whose constituents had become, in their estimation, indistinguishable from other white Americans, even more like wasps than the wasps. Amid such proclamations, it's not difficult to imagine what a shock the legal setback of Hart-Celler must have been for Irish Americans like O'Rourke, who plainly struggled to accept that his compatriots' seemingly definitive and inviolable whiteness would no longer hold sway in the court of immigration law. He was not alone. Throughout the hearings of 1968 and 69, Irish American politicians and witnesses alike would level repeated claims about the injustice, disadvantage, and reverse discrimination suffered by their compatriots. Now, by the 1980s, advocates had turned to more circumspect language. For instance, Representative Brian Donnelly expressed his support for the Irish several times through this circumlocutory expression. You cannot solve the problems of discrimination by eliminating it for some and creating it for others. Similarly, in a December 1987 Senate hearing, Donald Martin of the Irish immigration reform movement alluded to prior acts of discrimination like Chinese exclusion, without drawing an explicit parallel to the Irish, claiming that Hart-Celler rightfully and successfully eased discrimination against some nationalities, but had an unintentionally devastating impact on others. By the following year, he would discard the concept of discrimination altogether, declaring, "We in the IIRM do not choose to characterize ourselves as the victims of reverse discrimination. We believe that the truth is more complicated than that. We are the victims of unforeseen events and unexpected consequences." Martin's shift demonstrates a dawning recognition of which rights-based grievances white Europeans could safely invoke and which they could not. In fact, just 1 week earlier, during the first round of hearings, Representative Romano Mazzoli had challenged an Irish American over his use of the term reverse discrimination, prompting a group of immigration experts to categorically refute the notion that immigration law discriminated against Europeans. Martin and other Irish American supporters who clearly received the message retreated to the less objectionable arguments, like the claim that admitting more Irish would add balance and, wait for it, diversity to the now predominantly brown-skinned immigrant pool. The evolving rhetoric of these Irish campaigners was in part a strategic concession to Asian American and Latinx lobbyists with whom they had forged an unlikely coalition. The fact that the undocumented Irish were white and that their predecessors had benefited from a system that until recently had favored white migrants was lost on no one. We can read the Irish retreat from incendiary claims like reverse discrimination, in part as an effort to appease their collaborators and ensure the coalition's success. This shift may also signal a genuine shift in Irish American attitudes about race. As Timothy Maurer has argued, by the 1980s, many Irish Americans were generally supportive of minority advancement. But more than anything, the changing rhetoric suggests that organizers felt obligated to refurbish the public face of Irish whiteness. Much had changed since the hearings held in the late 1960s. Perceptions of the Irish had been tarnished by incidents like the Boston busing crisis of the 1970s, where South Boston residents fought to prevent school integration. And this is an image from one of those protests. The political arena was also different. On the one hand, non-discrimination had become an irrevocable cornerstone of immigration policy throughout English-speaking settler states in their intervening years, in word if not always in deed. But on the other hand, the racially specific demands of the civil rights movement had by the 1980s been co-opted by the right and converted into a more bland and diffuse recognition of human and civil rights. The increasingly circumspect language employed by Irish American campaigners illustrates how white ethnic groups learned to talk the talk. That is, learned to navigate the discursive terrain of post-civil rights politics, where diversity was celebrated, but race was to be addressed only in general or coded terms, and where the once potent terminology of minority grievance had been decontextualized and made available for all. As Irish American organizers began to temper the language of their demands, they relied increasingly on euphemism to convey why their compatriots, white English-speaking individuals coming from a long immigrant tradition, presented an especially strong case for admission. And in the time that remains, I want to focus on 3 of these euphemistic tropes upon which they tended to lean. So first, the Irish Immigration Reform Movement, or IIRM, who spearheaded much of the lobbying in the 1980s, often extolled the exceptional youth, education, and professional credentials of their contemporaries. They dubbed their generation the New Irish and characterized them as the most accomplished wave of immigrants to date. This theme would be reproduced by the Irish American and mainstream media, as well as by commentators in Ireland, who decried the departure of the country's best and brightest. The IIRM's claims may have been exaggerated, but the touted attributes of the New Irish made for a compelling story. During the late 1980s, prominent outlets like the New York Times and Time magazine featured the plight of the undocumented Irish in articles that mirror with near perfect precision the contemporary articles with which we began. Meanwhile, in Washington, lobbyists made impassioned speeches about the shadow-like existence that their extraordinarily qualified co-nationals were made to endure in, quote, cities that their family members from previous generations helped to build. Second, in addition to emphasizing the seeming incongruity of undocumented white Irish professionals, advocates also relied on euphemisms like articulacy and employability to advertise the unique desirability of migrants from Ireland. In 1988, Donald Martin told legislators, "One of the many attractions of a potential Irish immigrant is that he or she can arrive in this country on a Saturday evening, and due to their fluency in English, their skills, and their cultural closeness to the US, can begin work on Monday morning." Martin's emphasis on language fluency and prearranged employment was anything but arbitrary. Those same criteria had made it possible for white immigrants like the Irish to continue entering Canada and Australia, albeit at reduced rates, after the 2 countries abandoned race-based admissions in the 1960s and 70s, respectively. When Irish American advocates spoke of the enviable qualities of the New Irish, they were tapping into a lexicon of white exceptionalism, whose currency extended beyond US shores. Recent arrivals to Australia, for example, were hailed in the media as diligent, hard workers, very well groomed, and very well educated, while immigrants to the UK were characterized as attractive and articulate, and ambitious in a way that their predecessors were not. And third, perhaps the most consistent rhetorical trope in the Irish campaign for visas was that of the seed immigrant, which appears in congressional testimony as early as 1969. The term referred to enterprising European migrants of the 19th century, typically single, who arrived to the US with few ties, and who, it was said, built lives, families, and thriving communities for themselves. The seed immigrant capitalized on Americans' nostalgia for immigrants of old, who celebrated work ethic and contributions to the country, had by this point become axiomatic features of the national story. The grassroots organizing of Irish Americans in the 1960s through 1980s unfolded against the backdrop of what historians describe as a late 20th century white ethnic revival, where Americans of European descent drew on civil rights style identity politics in order to rediscover and reaffirm their immigrant roots, distant roots in many cases. Predicated on the new shade of normative whiteness that Matthew Fry Jacobson calls Ellis Island whiteness, this broad cultural phenomenon did not simply valorize white immigrant experience. Rather, it, quote, marked the emergence of a wholly new syntax of nationality and belonging. A change in personal feeling for some, perhaps, but a shift in public language for all. The concept of the seed immigrant echoed and reinforced the ethnic revival's reframing of America as a nation of white immigrants. As the IIRM put it, 19th century Irish immigrants' triumph over the discrimination symbolized by the "No Irish Need Apply" signs of old paved the way for other immigrant groups that followed. Their latter-day successors, it was implied, deserved the same opportunity. So in the end, Irish American lobbying efforts yielded mixed results. The 3 temporary visa programs that I mentioned earlier facilitated the immigration or legalization of over 70,000 Irish individuals between 1987 and 1994. Yet the diversity visa lottery that advocates fought so hard to secure would prove more symbolic than substantive. By the mid-1990s, the Celtic Tiger was underway, and Irish demand for US visas fell as employment surged at home. Since its inception in 1995, the primary beneficiaries of the lottery have been applicants from Africa, Eastern Europe, and Asia. And in recent years, the number of Irish recipients has dropped below 100 per annum. The Immigration Act of 1990 failed to enact a lasting solution to the problem of the undocumented Irish in the US, which continues to this day. So there are 2 important points that I believe we should take away from this history of the 1980s campaign for US visas. First, as I've been suggesting throughout this presentation and elsewhere, the project of Irish American racialization did not conclude in the 19th or 20th century, but instead earliest 20th century, but instead extends throughout the 20th into the 21st century. It is a project that has intensified periodically at key historical junctures, like the years following the Hart-Celler Act, when the finality of Irish American assimilation and the security of Irish Americans' racial positioning are called into question. We are emerging from another such juncture in the US, and it remains to be seen whether this most recent strain on Irish American whiteness will lead to a greater embrace of white ethno-nationalism, as we've already seen, or if instead it will generate increased solidarity with other immigrant groups whose paths to American residency or citizenship are currently impeded. And second, the history we've traced today also challenges us to reflect upon the disparity between the privileges that Irish and Irish American legislators are still fighting to secure for the Irish in the US, and the ongoing mistreatment of the migrants arriving to Ireland. The Dáil is still discussing remedies for the undocumented Irish in America, most recently in May of last year. All the while, the Irish state continues to issue deportation orders of its own. This discrepancy in treatment, to say nothing of the delayed phase out of direct provision, illustrates what Ronit Lenton has aptly identified as the racial priorities of a, quote, diaspora state, where bloodline claims to Irish citizenship, including those made by people who have never set foot in Ireland, are prioritized over the applications of migrants. This convergence of state interest and state neglect is unsurprising if we consider the legacies of the diversity visas campaign. The white New Irish of 1980s and the largely non-white New Irish of the 21st century are not only bound together by name. They are twin manifestations of a profoundly ambivalent racial sensibility, one that has only become more savvy in its journey across the Atlantic. And this is where you can find me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was quite wonderful. I guess a negotiation, as you say, of Irish whiteness, and it's certainly a huge amount of food for thought there. So without any further ado, I'm delighted to invite Dr. Cian McMahon then to respond to the paper, and then please feel free then all attendees, if you want to put anything into the Q&A, we'll get to those as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Verena. Thank you to Sarah for inviting me to participate this afternoon. Yeah, and thanks to Matthew and Dan for organizing everything so effectively. I'm just going to start off with Sarah's invited me to take 5 minutes to make some introductory comments, questions, raise some issues. I'm going to do that, and then I'll hand the mic back over to Verena so that we can open up to a more general conversation. So thank you, Sarah, for this thought-provoking and intelligent paper on the Irish and issues of race in the late 20th and early 21st century. As you know, I wrote my own PhD on the question of Irish racial identity. That was amongst the Irish at home and abroad in the mid-19th century. The dissertation was called, "Did the Irish Become White?" And the book ended up being called "The Global Dimensions of Irish Identity." So in it, I argued that in the eyes of the Irish that I studied, the differences amongst quote unquote white folks were as important as similarities. But of course, that's not to suggest that, I don't recognize that the Irish have occupied a very complicated spot in the American racial hierarchy over the centuries. And it's also not to suggest, of course, that race is not a useful way to understand, as you call them, or as they're known, the new Irish of the 1980s and 1990s. So I think you're onto something really big and important here, and I'm just delighted that I got a chance to read the paper and think about it. Of course, I got some questions. I have three kind of questions. They're like issues questions that I thought you might address in greater detail as you move forward with this excellent project. Before I go into those three, I want to briefly say that I think that maybe I'm going to say four, okay? And the first one is a small one. There was a book that came out a number of years ago by Jennifer and Eugene Duffy called "Who's Your Paddy?" And it looks at a three-cornered intergenerational fight amongst the Irish in America in the late 20th century over questions of race and respectability. And it didn't do terribly well with professional historians, in part because of it employs some glib generalizations that are particularly helpful, like bad paddy versus good paddy. But it's an interesting book, and it speaks so closely to the issues that you're wrestling with, that I think at least mentioning it or acknowledging that her work is there would help. Okay, so the three main points. Now the good stuff. So I didn't feel as if you gave us a good, clear definition of what you mean by whiteness, and I know that whiteness often stands in as a code name for white privilege. If you're talking about someone's protection from, say, being kidnapped and sold into slavery, as was the threat for African Americans during or before the Civil War, then the benefits of white privilege are fairly clear. Then again, of course, the fact that the Irish were never subject to being kidnapped and sold into slavery shows the weakness of the original claim that they had to, quote unquote, become white. But my point is that in the case study that you're offering here, right, where the lines and the boundaries between the white Irish and the non-white Asian and Latinx immigrants are blurry at times, I do think that a clear definition of what you mean by white and whiteness would be really helpful and important. So that's the first point. The second is that the heart of the essay lies in this exciting outline of, as you call them, the strategic ways in which Irish whiteness has been renegotiated and redeployed periodically through the 20th and the 21st centuries. And you end your essay with a bang, with this really cool analysis of the euphemisms that Irish Americans employed to make their case for admission into America. So these are, the first is youth, education, professional experience. The second is articulacy and employability. And the third is the idea of the Irish as, quote, seed immigrants. So someone, myself, who teaches a class on US immigration and who makes his students employ political cartoons to analyze the hidden, often racialized messages behind tropes and euphemisms in these historical debates over immigration. I'm thinking especially of, for example, literacy tests as code for Italians, or unclean as code for Chinese immigrants. I'm alive to the ways in which people can use and have used racial dog whistles to stoke bigotry. So I think it's really important, and it's a good thing to do. And of course, Trump and others in American politics have perfected the art in recent years. But my point is that I think that you need to do a little more explaining in the text of your paper itself to show us how youth, education, professional experience, articulacy, and employability are actually racialized. So you tell us that they're racialized, but I would like some more concrete evidence making that connection. So for example, you go some way towards this by citing the quote from the IIRM lobbyist, talking about how the Irish have had to overcome non-Irish need apply signs. You also cite Matthew Fry Jacobson's work on Ellis Island whiteness. That's helpful. But my point is that I would like to see more concrete evidence to see exactly how this language is racialized. And that ties in with my first point, right, about defining whiteness. If we had a more concrete definition of what you mean by whiteness, it would be easier to connect this evidence. And I'm making that point. I'm not suggesting that we live in some sort of post-racial environment where none of this matters, right? It does matter here and now. Racialization of the Irish is perhaps as important now as ever, especially that it's being used by neoconservatives to peddle, fallacies like this white slaves thing. So those are my first 2 points: definition, more clear connection to the euphemisms and racism. And third and finally, as you move forward with defining this and doing this, I would encourage you to think about, I would encourage you to think about making sure that whiteness and or race don't end up crowding out other dimensions of what's really an interesting and complicated subject, right? Like when I look back on some of these euphemisms you've listed, again, education, professional experience, articulacy, employability, I see a lot of social class and perhaps some gender at work here too. Like by using those terms, Irish people are also being described and defined as good little workers, trained in the modes and mindsets of bourgeois, industrial, or post-industrial capitalism. So I'd have to read some more about some of the specific issues at stake in this particular case study, but I'd be shocked if gender is not at work here too. So again, that's not to say that the race isn't applicable here. It's to make sure that it doesn't crowd out other dimensions such as class and gender. And so in conclusion, these are the three things I would say: is defining whiteness more carefully, providing more concrete connections back to racism, and making sure that whiteness and race don't become so big that they crowd out other important things. I have to stop talking now so that we can hear from others. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Cian, for that. And I guess I'm very conscious that it was such a short paper as well to address all those issues. But I will hand it back to Sarah if you'd like to respond to any of those, Sarah. There's no questions as yet. I mean, people are welcome to put questions into the Q&A, but if you'd like to respond, Sarah, you're...
Thank you for that so much, Cian. As you know, I really appreciate the perspective of an historian. I am trained as a literary scholar. I am, moving into more interdisciplinary work, and it's really helpful. I think one of the things that you're putting your finger on is how slippery this term is, depending on who is using it. This term of whiteness, right? One of the things that strikes me about both the 1980s sort of media coverage and the media coverage in the contemporary moment is that whiteness is assumed to be the self-evident thing. And, the shocker, right, that sort of narrative twist in each of these stories is, but they're white. Can you believe it? And there's a picture of a white person sitting in, institutional, garb, right, in handcuffs, waiting to be arraigned or deported or whatnot. And so I think, part of what these campaigners were doing in the 1980s was working between very popular assumptions of who the Irish were, And we're working with very popular understandings that the Irish had advanced to something that we might call security in mainstream white society, whatever that looks like. But I also really take your point, and in fact, the project is, each of the chapters is looking at a different lever of this Irish American assimilation. And I think you're right in saying it's a class assimilation, it's a gender assimilation, it's a residential assimilation in many kinds, in many instances, and it's also professional. And so each of the chapters sort of looks at how the idea of whiteness becomes a way of describing and understanding other shifts that they undergo. So when they start leaving, for instance, their ethnic enclaves, their inner city ethnic enclaves, and moving out to the suburbs, there's a real sense of loss and longing attached to that sort of departure. And so one way of narrating what is happening is that they have become whiter, and these new waves of immigrants get to come in and settle into urban enclaves and set up their own immigrant neighborhoods, and eventually they will work the same path. And so this idea that the Irish sort of pave a path to assimilation, I think is something that they hang on to. Similarly, in this 80s moment, I think there's a real nostalgia, especially coming out of the white ethnic revival, for this older pattern of migration where you have a consistent stream of people coming over, and they join a very strong Irish American community, usually on the East Coast of the country, and eventually they assimilate and sort of blend into society. I want to think a lot more about the specifically racial dimensions of those narratives that they're both telling themselves and promulgating in the media and laying before legislators, because they're different arguments in each case. And I think the white racial dimension of them is not the same. I take that point, and I think that's really useful for going forward and thinking about what's different about how you present yourself in these press conferences versus what you say to legislators about the nitty-gritty details of a package of immigration reform. So thank you for getting me thinking about some of those questions. I appreciate it.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So we'll open up to the floor now. If anyone has any questions, I can see there's one there from Sinead Moynihan. Sinead says, "Great paper, Sarah. I'd love to hear more about these questions, more about how these questions play out in literary cultural texts. Can you talk us through an example briefly?"
That's a great question. Hi, Sinead. Great to see you. I'm going to be honest. I don't know a lot of later 20th century Irish American literature. In fact, this project began as, I initially conceived it as a historical project that also would turn largely to literary texts. And I've turned further away from that because I'm finding the most compelling narratives in government documents, in housing planning documents, in materials from the, say, Corktown Historical Society, and in a lot of this congressional testimony where this whiteness is being constructed. But I'd appreciate suggestions if you have them or if anyone else has them, because I think that this work also can take place in literature, and largely it's my lack of familiarity with Irish American literature. So thanks, Sinead.
Okay, and there's another question here from Eric Boosted, who says, "Such a fascinating and timely topic. You mentioned Irish as settlers as well as immigrants. How do you see decolonization, repatriation coming into play with this topic, especially given Irish experience of colonization and burgeoning discussions of indigeneity in Ireland?"
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And I think it gets actually to something that Kian mentioned, which is there is not this monolithic Irish American racial attitude or Irish American politics. And in fact, even in the period that I'm looking at, there's a real divide between earlier generations of people who came over in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, who, in many cases saw the new generation of people coming over as these young, privileged upstarts who were, complaining about the fact that they couldn't get, visas, weren't really, willing to put in the hard work. And they saw it as sort of overly focused on the issues of other immigrant groups rather than specifically focused on Irish American interests. And so, even within the Irish American community, there are folks who really aren't interested in asking for blanket amnesty for undocumented Irish immigrants across the board, even though that's something that the IIRM was willing to entertain. And so I think, those divisions point to the much larger issue of the fact that attitudes toward racial advancement across and among Irish Americans and Irish people as well has been across the board. And, I'm not going to speak with a lot of authority about the 19th century, but certainly, the rifts in Irish America continue. And I think the reason that they don't become more pronounced in the history that I'm looking at is because immigration reform was something that generally most people could get on board with. One of the funny things I think we forget is even that there was a lot of bipartisan US support for these kinds of changes. And so, Irish Americans could kind of rally around this one particular issue when meanwhile there were deep divisions within the kind of the social fabric of these different generations of Irish Americans, and differences among people when it came to Northern Ireland in particular. So this was a kind of an easy one to rally Irish Americans around, but I think it's absolutely covering over a much more divided Irish American community, if you can even call it that, by the 1980s.
Great, thanks Sarah and Eric for that question. And Sinead just came back then was thinking of Alice McDermott when you mentioned the suburban melancholia a moment ago, for example, at weddings and wakes. Are there anybody else want to jump in with a question at all? Eric says thank you. Okay. No. Cian, anything you want to add?
Oh, don't get me started. I mean, I think this is such a big and important subject. I mean, maybe I could go back to something or follow on with something that somebody brought up. Yeah, I think the Sinead, sorry, it was Sinead Moynihan. Hi, Sinead. That Sinead brought up about cultural texts. I hear you, Sarah, when you say that as you get into sources, that the sources start to reveal themselves as you move forward, and so you think you're going to follow this, but you actually, but it might be really useful and interesting to talk to people. Maybe Matthew Fee could help you think about cinema and stuff, and maybe some of the ways in which. So there's been a lot written, obviously, on cinema in like the 1940s, 50s, 60s, but I don't know myself. Maybe there is, but how are Irish Americans describing themselves in issues, in say cultural texts or cinema, drama in the 1980s and 90s, and in what ways are they expressing kind of anxieties over citizenship, deportation, etc. I just don't know, but there could be some really cool stuff there on that subject. And then one other thing that I thought of was that and this might be pushing the boat out too far, but I've been recently reading about and thinking about the Irish Gay and Lesbian associations. That's what they're called, the Irish Gay and Lesbian Association. Their campaign to be able to march under a rainbow flag, march openly as part of the St. Patrick's Day parade. That campaign comes to fruition in 2016 when they're first allowed to do so. But they're like boots on the ground every St. Patrick's Day through the late 80s and through the 90s, trying to express and they're talking about a version of Irish that doesn't fit with the classic, like white Catholic male, straight. So I don't know, that might be another thing that you might consider, just poking around on the edges of it and see if it leads to. One of their leaders, Anne Maguire, wrote a book on the process called Rock the Sham. I can't remember the subtitle, but it's called Rock the Sham. instead of shamrock. And yeah, that might be another angle that might bear fruit.
Thanks. That's a great suggestion. And yeah, I know, recently some of the most exciting work in Irish American whiteness has been very contemporary and has been focusing on different modes of expression besides, traditional literature as we know it. So focusing on social media, focusing on like social influencers, YouTube bloggers, people like that. I just revealed my age by calling them YouTube bloggers. But, Diane Negra's doing a lot of interesting work, and so is Liam Kennedy, just thinking about the more contemporary expressions of Irish Americanness, which aren't really largely unfolding. There are exceptions, right? Wild Irish Time, things like that, but largely are unfolding in different media. And so I wonder, in addition to literature, what other kinds of publications, what other modes of expression people are thinking through their Irishness in the 1980s and 1990s. And I know in the 70s, I found like a lot of really interesting stuff around some of the historical preservation movements, where, Irish American groups are trying to get old neighborhoods designated with historical, landmark status, right? And in those kinds of their newsletters and in some of the literature of those campaigns, you get really interesting sort of thinking through about what it means to have this legacy, but to have, assumed what one scholar calls like detachable whiteness. Detachable ethnicity. It's a certain kind of whiteness, right? And so those have been really interesting to me. And I think it's absolutely worth thinking through what other narrative vehicles there are in the 80s and 90s, because they'll differ from the ones that you have in the 20s and 30s, say. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Sarah. So I think we've got time for one more question, and there's one there from Gabrielle. She says, "Thank you for this. Might you comment a little about how this carries over into white supremacy and nationalist groups? I'm thinking of links between your work and Natasha Casey's scholarship about how Irishness is deployed by these groups."
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, what I should say from the outset is that's part of my motivation for looking at these earlier periods in Irish American racial formation, where I think, their presumed whiteness or their presumed assimilation into white mainstream society is being threatened. And you see this kind of scrambling to make sense of it. That very much provides the origins for the kind of backlash that we're seeing right now, and for the way that both Irish Americans and people who don't necessarily have Irish descent but are looking to Irish culture in order to flavor their whiteness. Diane Negra calls it an enriched form of whiteness. That's absolutely happening in the US. And there are a bunch of people who are doing really interesting work. Amy Kluge in particular is doing fascinating work on the way that Irish American symbols are being used to fashion a particular brand of whiteness in the US. And it's a brand that, the Fox News media, commentators, and that whole parade of, Irish American loudmouths, that's what Van Koss calls them, in and around the Trump administration. They're all performing a version of this whiteness. I think it's the version of imperiled whiteness. And part of that narrative leans very heavily on the bootstraps myth that the Irish arrived to the US. They were not considered on par with other people, and they pulled themselves up. And of course, it's a way of denigrating, minority calls for justice and equality. And so I think, part of what fascinates me about this earlier work is that it provides a context for where that comes from. That doesn't come from nowhere. That doesn't sort of rear its ugly head because all of a sudden there's all these Irish Americans in the Trump administration or in the conservative media. I think, if you dig deeper, you can see this crisis and this real fear around the fragile whiteness of Irish Americans throughout the 20th century. And it erupts in really ugly ways at particular moments, like the Boston busing crisis, like, the contemporary versions of it. Thanks for the question.
Great question and answer. Okay, so we've, I think our time is coming to a close. So that was just it was a fascinating paper, and indeed the questions and the response as well from Cian, and it's certainly really I think challenge all of us who are here to kind of rethink then some of the kind of the grand narratives that we think of in terms of migration and emigration and into the States and beyond. So Sarah, thank you so much for being with us today, and Cian too. I know it was a very much earlier start for you two than it was for the rest of us here, for those of us that are here in Ireland, and many thanks, and looking forward then to reading what emerges from the research. So thanks again, Sarah and Cian.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.